I babysat a 5-year-old girl named Sophie who wore pink dresses and painted nails. On my first day, she whispered, "I'm not really Sophie," and begged me not to tell mommy. I found out the real Sophie died as a baby 7 years ago, and the parents were forcing their son, Samuel, to be their dead daughter, making him sit to pee, banning boy toys, and installing cameras when I trimmed an inch of his hair. The first day I arrived at the Dickens household, they introduced me to Sophie. Sophie was a 5-year-old boy. He stood there in a pink dress and a long wig, accompanied by little dress shoes and painted nails that didn't suit him. At first, I assumed the family had just finished playing dress up or something, especially since the boy looked so uncomfortable. But then the parents started giving me detailed instructions on how to interact with Sophie. They told me to refer to her as Princess. If she wants to watch cartoons, show her Powerpuff Girls. Even told me to only give her feminine foods, whatever that means. I remember making this very confused but understanding face, one the Dickens evidently picked up on. They immediately started explaining Sophie was exploring her identity, and they were modern thinking, so they were allowing it. But when I looked at Sophie, this didn't seem to be the case at all. The moment the parents left that first day, something weird happened. Sophie looked right at me and whispered, "I'm not really Sophie." I asked him gently who he really was, but his eyes went wide and he slapped his hand over his mouth. "Please don't tell mommy I said that," he begged, and ran up to his room. His voice had this fear I'd only heard in children who were hit. A few minutes later, I went up to his room just to check on how he was doing, and saw him quietly brushing the hair of his dolls in this mechanical way. He had tears streaming down his cheeks, and kept quietly humming something about being Sophie. Over the next few weeks, things got progressively stranger and more heartbreaking. I remember helping organize some paperwork one day when I found his birth certificate. Shocker, he wasn't Sophie, he was Samuel. I asked him what he wanted me to call him the moment I found out, but he just shook his head really hard and said, "Sophie doesn't like other names." The way he talked about himself in third person creeped me out. I also found out about all these crazy rules he had to follow. He wasn't allowed to wear pants, even when stepping outside in the freezing cold January. He was forced to sit down to pee. He was also banned from playing with boy toys like building blocks and toy cars. The worst was when I asked him if he wanted me to cut his hair because it clearly kept annoying him. I do, but mommy cries when I ask that, so I never cut it. I proceeded to trim in by an inch and told him it would be our little secret. I think he liked that. The thing was, the more I watched him, the more intense Mrs. Dickens got about everything. The day after I cut his hair by an inch, she installed cameras in the playroom. She never said anything to me, but it's like she knew. She also started texting me constantly throughout the day. "Is Sophie playing correctly? Send photos." 2 months into babysitting, the kid started referring to himself only in third person all the time, something he never did before. "Sophie doesn't like trucks, Sophie likes dolls," he'd say, even when playing alone. That's when 9 weeks in, I found it. I was getting supplies from the Dickens hall closet and accidentally knocked over some picture frames. Turns out that was the best possible thing that could have happened. You see, behind the others was this photo that made the gears in my head turn. The photo was of a newborn baby, surrounded by tubes and wires in what was clearly a NICU. On the back in Mrs. Dickens' handwriting, it said Sophie's first day, with a date from 7 years ago, 2 before Samuel was even born. And then, literally that same day while coming back from a walk with Sophie, this elderly woman next door stopped us. She knelt down and looked at Sophie with such concern. "Is Sophie all right?" she asked me quietly. She always looks so rigid, like she's performing. Then she touched his shoulder really gently and said, "Children should play, not perform. Remember that," before heading inside. Something changed in Sophie after that. The next day during art time, I was coming back from the bathroom when I heard this determined snipping sound. I rushed back in, and there was Sophie with craft scissors in hand, deliberately cutting chunks of his long hair off. He was whispering something over and over, and when I got closer, I heard it. "Children should play. Children should play." When Mrs. Dickens arrived early to pick him up and saw what happened, she completely lost it. Absolutely lost it. She started screaming, "Why does this keep happening? And you're ruining everything again." She was sobbing and trying to forcibly attach the spare hair extensions she always kept onto Sophie. Sophie tried to comfort her, which is when everything became horrifyingly clear. "It's okay, mommy. The first Sophie didn't mean to go away either," he said in this small voice. Mrs. Dickens went completely white. "You don't know about that," she hissed, but Sophie kept going. "Yes, I do. You tell me about her when you think I'm sleeping. The real Sophie who was your baby. She got sick and died when she was 3 days old. That's why you make me be Sophie." That's when it all made sense. The photo in the closet was their actual Sophie. They were forcing Samuel to be their dead daughter. And what's even scarier is the way Mrs. Dickens screamed about ruining everything again clearly meant this wasn't the first time he'd tried to break free from being Sophie. I remember attempting to step in, but before I could, Mrs. Dickens grabbed Sophie and basically ran to their car, muttering about getting it right this time. Before I knew it, my number was blocked, and when the next morning I arrived at the Dickens house, all their stuff was cleared out. I spent the next 3 weeks driving past their old house every day after work. The empty driveway mocked me. The realtor sign on the lawn felt like a personal failure. I kept thinking about Samuel trapped in that pink dress, forced to be someone who died before he was even born. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While grocery shopping, I spotted a familiar figure in the cereal aisle. It was the elderly neighbor who had spoken to Samuel that day. She recognized me immediately and approached with concern etched across her face. We talked briefly near the frozen foods. She mentioned seeing the family at a park 2 towns over last weekend. Samuel had been wearing a frilly purple dress despite the cold weather. The woman had tried to approach them, but Mrs. Dickens had quickly gathered Samuel and left. Armed with this information, I started spending my weekends visiting parks in that area. It took 4 attempts before I finally spotted them. Samuel sat alone on a bench while his parents talked to another couple nearby. His posture was rigid, hands folded perfectly in his lap. Even from across the playground, I could see how he kept adjusting the long wig that clearly bothered him. I started walking toward him, my heart pounding, but Mrs. Dickens must have developed a sixth sense. She turned, saw me, and immediately rushed over to grab Samuel. They left so quickly that Mr. Dickens had to jog to catch up with them. The next few weeks became a frustrating pattern. I would find them somewhere, try to approach, and Mrs. Dickens would spot me and flee. The grocery store, the library, even a children's museum 40 minutes away. Each time, Samuel would see me and his eyes would light up for just a moment before his mother dragged him away. I realized I needed a different approach. Direct confrontation wasn't working. Mrs. Dickens had become hypervigilant, constantly scanning for threats to her delusion. So I started observing from a distance instead, trying to understand their new routine. They had moved to a house about 20 minutes from their old neighborhood. It was more isolated, with a high fence around the backyard. I noticed they rarely left except for essential errands. Samuel no longer attended any activities or classes where other adults might notice something wrong. One afternoon, I parked down the street and watched through binoculars. Samuel was in the backyard, sitting at a small table having a tea party with dolls. His movements were mechanical, going through the motions without any joy. Mrs. Dickens sat on the porch, watching him like a hawk. What disturbed me most was how he kept touching his hair. The wig was longer now, reaching past his shoulders. Every few minutes, he would tug at it or scratch underneath it, then quickly stop himself and smooth it back down. The gesture spoke volumes about his discomfort. I started documenting everything. Photos from a distance, notes about their routines, anything that might help. But I knew documentation alone wouldn't be enough. The family had likely convinced any authorities that they were progressive parents supporting their child's identity. Without Samuel explicitly asking for help, who would believe the truth? The situation escalated when I tried approaching their new house directly. I rang the doorbell one evening, hoping to at least speak with Mr. Dickens. Instead, Mrs. Dickens answered through the intercom without opening the door. She threatened to call the police if I didn't leave immediately. Her voice had an edge of hysteria that made me back away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Samuel performing femininity like a trained seal, afraid to be himself even in private. The image of him mechanically brushing doll hair while tears streamed down his face haunted me. I decided to try reaching out to extended family. Through social media searches, I found Mrs. Dickens had a sister living 2 states away. I sent her a carefully worded message expressing concern about Samuel. She never responded, but her profile went private the next day. My next attempt involved a local elementary school. I went to the office and asked about enrollment for Samuel Dickens. The secretary informed me that the family had registered as Sophie Dickens for homeschooling, another dead end. The breakthrough came accidentally. While shopping at a craft store, I overheard 2 women discussing a homeschool co-op that met weekly at the community center. One mentioned a new family with a sweet but odd little girl named Sophie, who seemed terrified of doing anything wrong. I started attending the community center during their meeting times. Sure enough, there was Samuel, sitting with a group of children doing art projects. Mrs. Dickens hovered nearby, correcting his posture and reminding him to sit like a lady. I volunteered to help with the co-op, using a fake name and keeping my distance from the Dickens family. Over several weeks, I watched Samuel interact with other children. He gravitated toward building activities but would quickly stop himself and return to more appropriate crafts. Other kids seemed confused by his behavior. One day, a boy asked Samuel if he wanted to play cars during free time. Samuel's whole face lit up before immediately shutting down. "Sophie doesn't like cars," he said in that haunting third-person voice. The boy shrugged and walked away, leaving Samuel staring longingly at the toy vehicles. Mrs. Dickens' paranoia increased each week. She started sitting closer to Samuel during activities, whispering constant reminders about being a good girl. She brought specific toys from home so he wouldn't be tempted by the wrong ones. Other parents began noticing her intensity. The situation reached a turning point during a holiday craft session. Children were making ornaments, and Samuel accidentally knocked over a container of glitter. It was clearly an accident, but Mrs. Dickens' reaction was extreme. She grabbed his wrist and hissed something about ruining everything again. Several parents witnessed this. Samuel's response broke my heart. He immediately started apologizing in that third-person voice. "Sophie is sorry. Sophie will be more careful. Sophie promises to be good." Ha! Nothing says totally normal parenting, like fleeing from grocery stores and parks like you're in some kind of spy movie where the bad guys are after you. I love how the neighbor lady just casually drops this info by the frozen peas like, "Oh yeah, saw them at a park 2 towns over." She's basically become an unofficial detective at this point. His hands shook as he tried to clean up the glitter. Other children stared, clearly uncomfortable. After that incident, I overheard 2 mothers discussing their concerns about the Dickens family. They mentioned how Sophie never seemed happy, how the mother was overbearing, how something felt off about the whole situation. But concern wasn't action, and they did nothing beyond gossip. I knew I was running out of time. Samuel was getting worse, retreating further into the Sophie persona with each passing week. The spark of rebellion I'd seen when he cut his hair was fading. If something didn't change soon, I feared he might lose himself entirely in this forced identity. The homeschool co-op became my lifeline to Samuel, but I had to be careful. Mrs. Dickens watched me with increasing suspicion whenever I helped with activities. I made sure to interact with all the children equally, never showing special attention to Samuel. Still, I could feel her eyes tracking my every movement. During snack time one afternoon, I noticed Samuel sitting alone while other children chatted in groups. He arranged apple slices on his plate in perfect symmetry, then rearranged them again. His hands moved with that same mechanical precision I'd seen with the dolls. When another child accidentally bumped his elbow, causing an apple slice to fall, Samuel's whole body tensed. He quickly picked it up and resumed his pattern, glancing nervously at his mother. Mrs. Dickens had started bringing a notebook to the co-op sessions. She wrote constantly, documenting every interaction Samuel had. I watched her scribble furiously when a girl complimented Samuel's dress, noting his response with frightening intensity. The other parents had begun avoiding her, creating a bubble of isolation around the Dickens family. My chance to learn more came when the co-op coordinator asked for volunteers to help organize the supply closet. I immediately offered, hoping to find the enrollment forms. While sorting through papers, I discovered the Dickens family's registration. The emergency contact section caught my eye. A phone number for someone named Theodore, listed as Samuel's uncle. I memorized the number and later that evening, made the call from a payphone across town. Theodore answered on the 3rd ring. When I explained who I was and my concerns about Samuel, there was a long silence. Then he told me this wasn't the first time someone had called about his nephew. 2 years ago, a preschool teacher had reached out with similar worries. Theodore had tried to intervene then, but his brother had cut off all contact. Theodore revealed disturbing details about the family's past. After their daughter died, Mrs. Dickens had suffered a complete breakdown. She'd kept the nursery exactly as it was, buying new clothes in increasing sizes as if Sophie was still growing. When Samuel was born, she initially rejected him, refusing to hold or feed him. Then suddenly, when he was about 2, she'd started calling him Sophie and dressing him in the dead daughter's clothes. The conversation with Theodore gave me new determination, but also new fears. He warned me that his sister-in-law's mental state had deteriorated significantly. She'd become convinced that Samuel was Sophie reincarnated, sent back to her by God. Any threat to that delusion could trigger dangerous behavior. I started noticing changes in Samuel during co-op sessions. He'd developed a nervous tic, constantly smoothing down his dress and checking that his wig was straight. When working on projects, he would mouth words silently, as if reciting rules to himself. Once, I saw him reach for a blue crayon, then jerk his hand back and choose pink instead. The weather grew colder, but Samuel still arrived in dresses. I watched him shiver during outdoor time, his bare legs covered in goosebumps. When I suggested suggested to the coordinator that we should require weather-appropriate clothing. Mrs. Dickens overheard. She pulled Samuel from the next 2 sessions, claiming he was sick. When they returned, Samuel seemed even more withdrawn. He now spoke exclusively in whispers, always in that disturbing third person. During story time, when the book featured a boy protagonist, I noticed Samuel covering his ears subtly. Mrs. Dickens had clearly intensified her conditioning at home. I decided to try a different approach. At the craft store, I bought supplies for a project, decorating picture frames. I made sure to include materials in every color, including blues and greens. During the activity, I placed all the options within Samuel's reach, curious to see what he would choose when given freedom. Samuel's hand hovered over a blue ribbon for several seconds. His fingers actually touched it before he glanced at his mother and selected pink instead. But I'd seen the longing in his eyes. There was still a part of him that wanted to choose for himself. Mrs. Dickens must have noticed too. The following week, she arrived with a pre-made craft kit for Samuel, all pink and purple materials. She explained loudly that Sophie had special needs and required specific supplies. The other parents exchanged concerned looks but said nothing. I began documenting everything more carefully. Photos of Samuel's fearful expressions, notes about his behavior changes, records of Mrs. Dickens' controlling actions. I stored everything in a safety deposit box, building a case for the day I might need it. The elderly neighbor from their old neighborhood became an unexpected ally. Her name was Victoria, and she'd been watching the Dickens family for years. We met for coffee, and she shared her observations. She'd seen Samuel try to play with toy trucks in the backyard once, only for Mrs. Dickens to take them away and make him write lines. Sophie is a good girl, over and over. Victoria had tried calling child services once, but without concrete evidence of physical abuse, nothing had been done. The family presented well on the surface. Clean home, well-fed child, no visible injuries. The psychological damage was harder to prove. Together, we developed a plan. Victoria would continue watching their new neighborhood, while I maintained my presence at the co-op. We exchanged phone numbers and agreed to share any concerning developments. It felt good to have someone else who understood the urgency of the situation. The breakthrough came during a co-op field trip to a local farm. Parents were encouraged to attend, and I volunteered as an additional chaperone. Samuel seemed excited about seeing the animals, his first genuine emotion I'd witnessed in weeks, but Mrs. Dickens dressed him in a delicate white dress and told him repeatedly that Sophie needed to stay clean. At the farm, Samuel watched longingly as other children ran through the barn and petted the animals. He stood perfectly still beside his mother, hands clasped in front of him. When a friendly goat approached, Samuel instinctively reached out, then caught himself and stepped back. During the hayride, I managed to sit across from Samuel. While Mrs. Dickens was distracted talking to another parent, I made eye contact with him. Very slowly, I mouthed the words, "It's okay to be you." Samuel's eyes widened, and for just a moment, I saw a flicker of hope. That flicker disappeared when Mrs. Dickens noticed our interaction. She immediately moved Samuel to the other side of the wagon and spent the rest of the ride whispering in his ear. I could see him nodding mechanically, his brief moment of connection severed. After the field trip, the Dickens family stopped attending co-op. I waited 2 weeks, hoping they would return, but they never did. I tried calling Theodore again, but the number had been disconnected. Even Victoria hadn't seen them around the neighborhood lately. Desperate, I started driving through nearby towns on weekends, checking parks and stores. It took 3 weeks before I spotted their car at a grocery store 2 towns over. I waited in the parking lot, hoping to see Samuel, but only Mr. Dickens emerged with bags. I followed him home, careful to stay far enough back. They'd moved again, this time to an even more isolated location. The house sat at the end of a long driveway, surrounded by woods, no neighbors within sight. My heart sank, realizing how completely they'd cut Samuel off from the outside world. I parked down the road and walked through the woods to get a closer look. Through the trees, I could see into their backyard. Samuel sat at a small table, having another tea party. But something was different. His movements were no longer just mechanical. They were completely lifeless. He looked like a doll himself, going through motions with no consciousness behind them. Mrs. Dickens sat nearby, reading from a book. As I watched, she would occasionally look up and correct Samuel's posture or hand position. He responded instantly, adjusting himself without any sign of resistance. The spark of rebellion I'd once seen was completely extinguished. I returned to my car feeling defeated. Every attempt to help had only driven the family deeper into isolation. Mrs. Dickens had won, creating a perfect bubble where her delusion could thrive unchallenged. Samuel was disappearing, replaced entirely by the Sophie persona. That night, I called Victoria to share what I'd discovered. She was equally concerned, but reminded me that we couldn't give up. She suggested reaching out to other family members, maybe finding someone Mrs. Dickens couldn't cut off so easily. It was a slim hope, but better than nothing. Through careful social media searching, I found Mrs. Dickens' mother living in a retirement community 3 hours away. I decided to visit, hoping she might have some influence over her daughter. The drive gave me time to plan what I would say, how I would explain the situation without sounding like a crazy person. The retirement home was welcoming, and I found Mrs. Dickens' mother, Faye, in the common room. She was a sharp woman in her 80s, with eyes that missed nothing. When I introduced myself and mentioned her grandson, her face fell. She knew exactly why I was there. They revealed that she'd been banned from seeing Samuel 2 years ago. She'd made the mistake of calling him by his real name and buying him a toy truck for his birthday. Mrs. Dickens had exploded, accusing her mother of trying to kill Sophie again. The pain in Faye's eyes was evident as she spoke. She showed me photos from before the ban. Samuel as a toddler, dressed normally, playing happily. The contrast to the child I knew was heartbreaking. They had tried everything to maintain contact, even hiring a lawyer, but her daughter had threatened a restraining order. We talked for hours, sharing our observations and fears. They confirmed that Mrs. Dickens had shown signs of mental illness even before Sophie's death, but the loss had shattered her completely. Mr. Dickens, weak-willed and conflict avoidant, had enabled her delusions rather than getting her help. Before I left, they gave me a small photo album. Inside were pictures of the real Sophie during her 3 days of life and early photos of Samuel. She asked me to somehow show them to Samuel, to remind him who he really was. I promised I would try, though I had no idea how. The drive home felt heavy with responsibility. I now had allies in Victoria and Thea, but we were all blocked from direct access to Samuel. Mrs. Dickens had created an impenetrable fortress around her manufactured daughter. Every route I tried led to another dead end. I decided to take a risk. Using the information from Theodore about the preschool incident, I tracked down the teacher who had tried to help before. Her name was Vicky, and she now worked at a different school. When I called, she remembered Samuel immediately. Vicky agreed to meet at a coffee shop. Well, isn't this turning into quite the detective story, complete with stakeouts in grocery store parking lots and sneaking through the woods like some kind of concerned citizen ninja? She looked tired, older than her years, and I soon understood why. Her attempt to help Samuel had cost her dearly. Mrs. Dickens had filed complaints complaints, made accusations, and ultimately forced Vicky to leave her job. The experience had clearly traumatized her. Despite her fear, Vicky shared valuable information. She'd kept copies of her documentation from back then, photos of Samuel being forced to wear dresses to preschool, notes about his distress, records of Mrs. Dickens' threatening behavior. She'd been building a case when everything fell apart. Vicky warned me to be careful. Mrs. Dickens had connections through her husband's work and wasn't afraid to use them. She'd painted Vicky as a bigot who couldn't accept a gender-exploring child, and people had believed it. The truth, that Samuel was being forced into an identity, was too uncomfortable for most to consider. I left the meeting with Vicky's old documentation and a growing sense of urgency. Samuel was now 7, spending his formative years trapped in a false identity. Every day that passed made it harder for him to remember who he really was. I knew I had to act fast. Samuel was disappearing more each day, and the isolation was making things worse. Victoria called me one evening with news. She'd seen the Dickens family at a local pharmacy. Samuel had been clinging to a stuffed animal, something Mrs. Dickens typically forbade as too childish for a young lady. The next morning, I positioned myself outside that pharmacy, hoping they might return. 3 days of waiting paid off when their car pulled into the parking lot. I watched Mrs. Dickens emerge with Samuel, who moved like a puppet on strings. His wig was now styled in elaborate curls that must have taken hours to create. Inside the store, I kept my distance while observing them. Samuel stood perfectly still as his mother shopped, hands clasped in front of him. When a toddler boy ran past playing with a toy truck, Samuel's eyes followed longingly. Mrs. Dickens noticed and immediately steered him away. I followed them through several aisles, trying to find an opportunity to slip Samuel the photo album from Thea, but Mrs. Dickens never let him out of arm's reach. Her paranoia had reached new heights. She constantly scanned the store, checking faces, monitoring anyone who came near. As they waited in line, I noticed Samuel scratching at his scalp under the wig. Mrs. Dickens grabbed his wrist and held it down, whispering something that made him go rigid. The cashier looked uncomfortable at the interaction, but said nothing. That afternoon, I met with Victoria and Thea at a diner halfway between our locations. We pooled our observations and resources, desperate to find a way through Mrs. Dickens's defenses. They mentioned that her daughter had always been vulnerable to pressure from her church community. Perhaps that could be our angle. Victoria had been attending the same church as the Dickens family before they moved. She agreed to return and see if anyone there had concerns about Samuel. Meanwhile, I would continue surveillance, looking for any crack in their routine. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While researching online, I found a support group for grandparents denied access to grandchildren. Thea joined immediately and discovered another grandmother facing similar circumstances with a different family. This woman had successfully used a mediator to restore contact. We contacted the same mediator, explaining the situation carefully. She listened with growing concern, but warned us that without concrete evidence of harm, options were limited. Still, she agreed to reach out to the Dickens family under the pretense of helping with family communication issues. Mrs. Dickens rejected the mediator's call immediately, but the attempt had an unexpected consequence. Mr. Dickens called the mediator back privately the next day. He was beginning to have doubts about his wife's behavior, but felt trapped. The mediator couldn't share details due to confidentiality, but she encouraged us to keep trying. She suggested documenting everything and being ready if Mr. Dickens reached out for help. It was the first sign that someone inside the family might be questioning the situation. I intensified my documentation efforts. Using a long-range camera, I captured images of Samuel's mechanical movements, his fearful glances at his mother, the way he flinched when she adjusted his clothing. Each photo told a story of a child performing rather than living. Victoria's church visits yielded results. Several congregation members had noticed the family's absence and were concerned. One woman mentioned seeing Samuel at the grocery store, noting how different he seemed from the happy boy they remembered. Victoria carefully planted seeds of worry without making accusations. 2 weeks later, Thea received an unexpected call. Mr. Dickens wanted to meet with her secretly. He chose a coffee shop an hour from their home, clearly terrified of being discovered. They asked me to accompany her for support. Mr. Dickens looked haggard when he arrived. He glanced around nervously before sitting down, as if expecting his wife to appear at any moment. His hands shook as he explained that things had gotten worse at home. Samuel barely spoke anymore, even in the third person. He'd stopped eating properly and had developed a nervous habit of pulling out his own hair when he thought no one was looking. The breaking point for Mr. Dickens had come when he found Samuel standing in front of a mirror at 3 a.m., practicing feminine gestures over and over like a broken robot. When he tried to comfort his son, Samuel had whispered one word: help. It was the first time in months he'd spoken as himself, not as Sophie. Mr. Dickens wanted to get Samuel help but didn't know how. His wife controlled everything: the finances, the homeschooling, their social connections. He feared she would take Samuel and disappear if he challenged her directly. The conversation revealed a man drowning in guilt and fear. He showed him the photo album she'd prepared for Samuel, pictures of the real Sophie, then Samuel as a baby and toddler, clearly a different child. Mr. Dickens broke down seeing them. He admitted he'd allowed the delusion to continue because it seemed to make his wife happy after years of grief. We developed a careful plan. Mr. Dickens would gradually take on more parenting duties, giving Mrs. Dickens breaks from the constant supervision. During these times, he would allow Samuel small freedoms, choosing his own snacks, playing with whatever toys he wanted, using the bathroom standing up. The first attempt nearly backfired. Mrs. Dickens returned early from her break to find Samuel playing with building blocks Mr. Dickens had bought. The explosion was severe, but Mr. Dickens held firm, saying Sophie had asked for them specifically. It was the first time he'd stood up to his wife in years. Over the following weeks, Mr. Dickens grew braver. He started taking Samuel on errands alone, letting him wear pants under his dress for warmth. He bought him a small toy car that Samuel hid under his mattress. These tiny acts of rebellion gave Samuel hope. I maintained my distance but stayed in contact with Mr. Dickens through Thea. He reported that Samuel was slowly coming back to life. He'd started making choices again, small ones but significant. Choosing apple juice over the pink lemonade his mother always gave him, picking up a blue crayon before remembering to switch to pink. The situation reached a crucial point when Mrs. Dickens announced they would be moving again, this time out of state. She'd found a better environment for Sophie's development, code for somewhere even more isolated. Mr. Dickens knew this would be the end of any hope for Samuel. That night, while Mrs. Dickens slept, Mr. Dickens did something that surprised us all. He packed a bag for himself and Samuel, taking only essentials and the hidden toy car. He drove to Thea's apartment at 2 a.m. with Samuel asleep in the back seat, still wearing a nightgown, but with his real hair visible beneath a wig that had been removed. The next morning brought chaos. Mrs. Dickens called everyone, police, family, friends, claiming her husband had kidnapped their daughter. But Mr. Dickens had been smart. He'd documented everything: the forced forced feminization, the birth certificate proving Samuel's identity, photos of his son's distress. He'd even recorded Mrs. Dickens talking about the dead Sophie while she thought Samuel was asleep. The police investigated but found no crime. A father taking his son to visit his grandmother wasn't kidnapping. Mrs. Dickens arrived at Thea's apartment screaming demands, but Mr. Dickens wouldn't let her in. For the first time, someone was protecting Samuel. The next few days were tense. Mrs. Dickens alternated between threats and pleading. She camped outside Thea's building, waiting for any chance to see Sophie. But Samuel, given the choice, didn't want to see her. He spent those days slowly remembering who he was. I visited once, bringing some of the documentation I'd collected. Samuel didn't remember me at first. Trauma had blurred many memories. But when I showed him a photo I'd taken of him trying to reach for the toy cars at co-op, something clicked. He whispered, "I remember wanting those." Mr. Dickens filed for emergency custody and a restraining order. The court process would be long, but he had strong evidence. Victoria and several church members provided statements about their concerns. Vicky, the former preschool teacher, bravely came forward with her old documentation despite her fears. During this time, Samuel began the slow process of reclaiming himself. He cut his own hair with safety scissors, choppy and uneven, but his choice. He picked out clothes from a thrift store, gravitating toward comfortable t-shirts and jeans. He still moved carefully, as if expecting someone to correct his posture, but each day brought small improvements. The most significant moment came when Thea asked what he wanted to be called. Without hesitation, he said, "Samuel." It was the first time in over a year he'd claimed his own name. Mr. Dickens cried hearing it. Mrs. Dickens' mental state deteriorated rapidly without her delusion to sustain her. She was found by police trying to break into Thea's apartment at night, calling for Sophie. The incident led to a psychiatric hold and evaluation. The doctors confirmed what we'd suspected. She'd never processed her daughter's death and had developed a severe delusional disorder. Mr. Dickens struggled with guilt over his wife's condition, but remained focused on Samuel's recovery. He found them a small apartment near Thea and enrolled Samuel in therapy with a specialist in childhood trauma. The therapist worked slowly, letting Samuel express himself through play and art. I stayed in touch through Thea, receiving updates on Samuel's progress. He was learning to make choices again, to express preferences without fear. He still had nightmares and would sometimes slip into third person when stressed, but these episodes decreased over time. The custody hearing was difficult but decisive. The judge reviewed all evidence and granted Mr. Dickens full custody with supervised visitation for Mrs. Dickens once she completed treatment. She refused initially, still insisting Samuel was Sophie, but eventually agreed to psychiatric care. 6 months later, Thea invited me to Samuel's 8th birthday party. It was a small gathering, just family and a few new friends from school. Samuel had chosen the theme himself, dinosaurs. He wore a t-shirt with a T-Rex on it and spent the party playing with other children like any normal boy his age. Watching him laugh while playing tag, it was hard to reconcile this child with the mechanical doll I'd first met. He still had quiet moments, still occasionally looked over his shoulder as if expecting correction, but he was healing, reclaiming the childhood that had been stolen from him. Mr. Dickens thanked me for not giving up when it would have been easier to walk away, but I knew the real heroes were Samuel himself, who found the courage to ask for help, and his father, who finally chose his son's well-being over maintaining a destructive peace. Samuel's recovery wasn't complete. Trauma like his doesn't simply disappear, but he was in therapy, surrounded by people who loved him for who he really was. He could choose his own clothes, play with any toys he wanted, and most importantly, be Samuel. The last time I saw him, he was starting 3rd grade. His hair was cut short by his own choice, and he proudly showed me his new backpack covered in superhero patches. When I asked how school was going, he smiled and said, "Good," speaking as himself, in first person, without fear. It was the ending I'd hoped for from that very first day. That good answer about school is such perfect kid energy too. Ask them about their whole day and you get one word, but I bet he could talk for hours about those superhero patches. That's all for this video. Subscribe for more.